July 2nd, 1863. The Confederate soldiers from across the field over here smash into the Union Army at this very location where the Massachusetts men are. Dan Sickles' men are getting tested. But when the smoke clears, one man is completely gone, nowhere to be found. His comrades are searching for him. They look all over the bodies out here. They can't find him anywhere. His family and his comrades wonder for weeks where he'd went. But what they didn't know was that Richard Baxter Smart would disappear and end up on a journey that only a soldier who'd been to a POW camp could tell. Welcome back to History with Waffles. Today we're in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We're going to take you to the site of the disastrous decision of the Battle of Peach Orchard, the location where Dan Sickles himself actually lost his leg. And then we will take you all the way to where the 1st Massachusetts men stood their ground on the 2nd day of July, 1863, and where one man disappeared from the lines. So stick around. We got one heck of a story to tell. Richard Baxter Smart was a young man from Brighton, Massachusetts. I hope I said that name correctly. And he enlists in the Union Army shortly after Fort Sumter. He spends a couple of years there with the Union Army, going to every single campaign, every single battle that Massachusetts in. Not one time does this man have a mark on his record that's negative. He never fouled his weapon. He never turned in broken equipment, gear. He was never disciplined for anything. He always had a clean record, clean track record. And he was at every single engagement. And then Gettysburg happened. So we're not out here to talk about Dan Sickles today. We're talking about the 1st Massachusetts Infantry that's out here on this field. But you can't talk about 1st Massachusetts on July 2nd without talking about Dan Sickles. He kind of makes himself the central focal point of almost every single story out here, besides Little Round Top. And even in the story of Little Round Top, you still have to go back to Dan Sickles' story right over here at the Peach Orchard. Sickles comes riding into town. He sees this piece of land that's higher than everything else. When he comes into town, it reminds him of something. He's got it focused in his head that he needs to go over there to the Peach Orchard and place artillery in that location. What he does, however, is he goes forward deployed almost an entire mile in front of his lines, and he ends up creating a salient that is very weak and vulnerable to Confederate soldiers. What he also does is he brings on a general engagement right here on this field when Longstreet doesn't want it to happen yet. As a result, Mississippi, all the Confederates are coming across this field directly in that direction. They're going to slam into the Union soldiers here who are putting up one heck of a fight to try to protect this ground. At the end of that fight, however, bodies are all out here across this field. Wounded soldiers are screaming, needing help, needing assistance. There are dead men laying on this field that can't be helped. 1st Massachusetts is looking around, and they're counting their wounded. They're counting their dead. It's a lot. It's a lot of people hurt out here from their unit. Richard Smart can't be found. They don't know where he's at. They just assume maybe he ran off. So at first he's missing. But then they find out later on he wasn't just missing. So when you look at the records in the American Civil War for soldiers, they have casualties, and a lot of people mistake that for dead. But the casualties include wounded, whether it's a slight wound or if it's a horrific wound, It also includes people who are dead, and it includes people that are missing. So what does missing mean? Well, in the Civil War, in those documents, and even today, missing can mean that the person is lost in combat. So in other words, they're out here on this field somewhere, and they have no idea where they're at, they can't account for them, so they don't know if that person is actually dead, wounded, or taken prisoner of war. So in this case, missing for him, Richard Smart, is going to mean that he's a prisoner of war. But his comrades don't know that, and neither does his family. July 2nd puts a halt to everything that man ever knew about fighting in combat, because now he's going to be on his way south to Richmond. So it's not a short journey for Richard Baxter Smart. He's taken prisoner of war here on this field, this very field where I'm standing right now in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. By July 21st, he is documented at being at the prisoner of war camps in Richmond, Virginia. But he doesn't spend very long there. Somehow he's able to make his way out of that prisoner of war camp, and he goes to City Point, Virginia, and then eventually he's transferred to Maryland. Many men end up prisoner of war during the American Civil War, and many of those men never make it out of those camps. They end up dying, or some of them live long enough to make it to the very end of the war in those camps. Richard Smart got lucky, however. He manages to make it back to his own unit October of that year. All right, a little orientation where we're at right now. This nice dirt path here is a path that horses normally take out here on the horse trails. And you can also walk this path to the First Massachusetts Monument. First Massachusetts Monument is over in that direction. You probably can't see it from here, but we're going to try to make our way over there and get across the street so you can see that monument for the First Massachusetts. The Sherfy Farm and peach orchard and all of that stuff spreads out all along through there. Peach orchard that everybody stops at is over there in that direction. And then the barn, the famous barn with the cannonball hole in it, is right over here. And this is where Dan Sickles has his headquarters in Horse, and he ends up losing his leg there. And that's where that famous story comes from, where he's coolly smoking a cigar as they take him off the field. But this is the location from which the Union soldiers are pushing themselves forward, and they're being positioned out here. Eventually, they have to fight across these fields to the Confederate soldiers that are out here. Now, that monument that's out there talks about their initial position on the field, and then it talks about their eventual position on the field. So we'll go over there, we'll talk a little bit more about that from that location. Now hopefully this wind isn't too much for us here at the First Massachusetts Monument here on the main road at Emmitsburg Road. But on the back side of this it says, on July 2nd, 1863, from 11 a.m. until 6:30 p.m., the 1st Regiment, Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Clark B. Baldwin, commanding, occupied this spot in support of its skirmish line 800 feet in advance. The regiment subsequently took position in the brigade line and was engaged until the close of the action. Casualties: killed 18, died of wounds 9, wounded 80, prisoners 15, total 122. Now that number is pretty significant considering they only carried in here, I think, maybe a little over 300 men in action. So that's pretty significant, and part of that 15 prisoner is our subject today. So Smart ends up surviving the American Civil War. He ends up surviving being a prisoner of war. He does not re-enlist in 1864, however. He said he'd had enough of the war. And he served his time, and he did it proudly. He did a good job at it. So when his service was up, he went back home. His story doesn't end there. Smart goes back home and he gets married. He ends up having 3 kids with his wife. And at the age of 75 years, he dies 52 years and 1 day after the conclusion of the Battle of Gettysburg, where he was taken prisoner of war right here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So many of them out there weren't so lucky. These battlefields were filled with people that died of disease and combat wounds, and they didn't make it back home. He was an active member in the Grand Army of the Republic, and he was constantly going back and forth to member meetings and being a part of everything. He was a well-liked person in his community, and his family remembered him fondly. But here at Gettysburg, he was a superhuman brave person, and he was standing the test that a lot of us don't know anything about. If you like what we do here at History with Waffles, and you like the stories about the American Civil War that we're telling here at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Antietam, Chancellorsville, and all the way down to Richmond, well, give us a thumbs up. Help keep our channel growing. Also, click on that video multiple times. That helps out too. And if you like the t-shirt I'm wearing, head on over to our channel store. Go ahead and purchase yourself a shirt. We have coffee cups and all kinds of stuff. Not a mandatory requirement to be a Waffle Squad member, but it definitely spreads the word about this channel, and it continues helping me tell the story about the American Civil War, the subject that all of us history nerds love to talk about. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our video here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, right where the 1st Massachusetts men actually stood in battle, facing the Confederate soldiers when Richard Smart was taken prisoner of war here across these fields, just adjacent to where Dan Sickles actually lost his leg. This place is filled with amazing stories about other soldiers just like this. This is only one, and there's plenty more to tell. So until next time, we'll see you out there on those fields. Live here from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, this is History with Waffles.